Hello, Tobin. It's great to have you with us today. So, to get started, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the kind of work that you do.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Tobin Jones. I'm a photojournalist who was born and raised throughout the African continent. And I currently live in Nairobi, Kenya, where I work as a photojournalist. So I've been in this career for about 10 years now. And I started off actually working in Somalia, doing communications work for the African Union there and the United Nations. So kind of since the beginning of my career, I've been doing a combination of kind of journalistic work, but also communications work. So I spent about 4 years based in Mogadishu in Somalia, following the African Union and their offensives against the terrorist group Al-Shabaab. And then after my time there, I turned into a full-on freelancer, where again, I was doing a combination of journalism, but also comms work for various NGOs and UN agencies around the region. So sorry, I'm just flicking through kind of a selection of my work fairly quickly because we don't have that much time, but this will kind of give you an idea of both the style of my photography and some of the different projects and countries that I've worked in. But yeah, I think one of the things I'm going to talk about today also will be the kind of evolution of my work from this kind of more straightforward photojournalism, where I started to a more conceptual type of photography that I've gotten into more recently. And I found that kind of this has really defined my career in photography and kind of how it's slowly evolved to maybe answer some of the questions that at least I thought originally maybe photography wouldn't be able to answer. And I think this is kind of one of the more interesting aspects of photography and you know, this idea of how we can take photography to new levels and use it to tell stories that maybe wouldn't normally be in the traditional vein of photography. I'll just go to a couple more examples of this. These are typologies of different objects that I've been photographing. A lot of this I've been doing last year during COVID, which has been kind of nice because, you know, obviously I don't have to photograph as many people doing this. These are some footballs that I've been collecting around Africa.
And these are personal projects, right? So you do a bit of both, you know, kind of shared between commissions and your own personal work.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think most photographers, what you'll kind of realize is that, yeah, a lot of their work is a mixture of work they do for clients or for newspapers, and then other work that they do for themselves. And this, you know, it's partly for ourselves, but it's also a way to kind of explore new types of photography, expand our portfolio, investigate new ways to tell stories. And, you know, obviously sometimes these projects will take a lot longer than maybe your typical assignment with a client where you only have a couple days to shoot something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's kind of a quick summary of my work. It's Tobin Jones Photography if anyone wants to check it out.
We can share you're active on Instagram as well, and there's other social media, so I can share that.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Also, kind of moving on to you know, this conversation, a lot of your work has centered around, you know, the humanitarian sector and international development, and I wonder if you can tell us why you think photography is an important and powerful tool in that space. And I think you're still sharing your screen. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen.
Oh yeah, sure. I'll stop sharing. And can you see me now? Okay, sorry. I think there's a bit of delay, but anyway, um, I'll do my best to answer these. Yeah, why is photography?
If we can, let's turn the videos off because the connection's a little bit unstable. And
okay, sure. Right. Yeah, I think photography is an interesting medium to kind of show this kind of work because, I mean, obviously so many of these humanitarian subjects are thousands of miles away from, the people in Europe, the people in the US, a lot of the donors who are the potential funders of these organizations. And, I'd say photography, maybe more than any other medium, is the best way to really show what's happening on the ground and to show it quickly. I think, we live in an age where people have a really short attention span, and someone can look at a photograph and get a lot of information very quickly. And not only information, but, photographs are obviously also really good at evoking emotion and empathy out of the viewer. And so I think, particularly over something like text, although it can complement text really well, I think a photograph can do more than maybe any other medium to really express what's happening on the other side of the world.
Yeah, and I imagine it's very powerful because it's immediate and it can be very powerful in a positive way. But I guess you could say that it can be positive in a negative way, in the sense that it can, carry dangerous messages very quickly as well. I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think photographs are only, they're subject to the motives of the person behind the camera, right? I mean, in the same way that maybe any other medium is. But I think, that whole idea that, a photograph tells the truth. Well, I mean, that's just not true. A photograph can be manipulated in the same way that anything else can be. If someone writes an article that doesn't really portray the events in the real way, photography can do the exact same thing. Just because we're photographing something, you have to realize that actually there's a person behind the camera, and he's chosen exactly what he wants to point the camera at that exact moment. And so, yes, it's extremely valuable to manipulation. And I think it's just important that people realize that. And I guess that's why, it's also important that we, photography is subject to criticism.
Yeah. And what are you seeking to convey in your images? I mean, are you hoping that people will feel a certain way after seeing them?
No, I think when when I go to a new place, when I go to a new area, I'm not really going in with any preconceptions, or at least I'm not trying to. I think it's fairly dangerous to do that because, even though it's impossible not to be biased in one way or another, I think what we should all be trying to do is keep an open mind. And so when I do go into a new situation, that's kind of what I try to do. Partly because I think when you do have these preconceptions, you end up, almost disappointed if those preconceptions don't play out. Maybe you're not getting the types of photographs that you want, or you're not able to cover the type of story that you want. but ultimately that's a dangerous thing. And so, yeah, what I just try to do is go in with an open mind and try to photograph what I see, even if that does mean manipulating the camera a little. At least I'm trying to manipulate it in as honest a way as as I think I can.
Mm. Yeah, I think you've said two important thing that kind of that kind of strike me. The first one is that there's no truth in photography. There's no objectivity, but at the same time we always carry a certain subjectivity, and as photographers we should try to be aware of that and keep an open mind. I think that's a good message, good takeaway message. um so now moving on to, well, you're co-founder of Non-Aligned, which is an independent collective of storytellers. And I read on the website that it says the world needs new narrative, new ways to understand complex issues, and new reasons to care. And can you tell us why you think there is a need to tell new stories and new narratives, especially in the humanitarian and development sectors?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Non-Aligned is essentially a collective that I started along with 4 other photographers and videographers a couple of years ago, and it was partly formed for kind of practical reasons. Partly to create a legal entity through which we could work through, partly just to create a team with which we could collaborate together with. But yeah, also partly to try and create an entity that NGOs or different comms professionals could approach at an earlier stage than maybe they normally would with a photographer or videographer, to kind of talk through the ideas that they're trying to convey, and then get feedback from us over how best to approach these projects or these ideas. I think one of the big problems about development comms in particular is that it's a very niche audience. You might have the donors, and you might have people that are maybe students of development, or people that are particularly interested in that subject matter, but it's a pretty small audience at the end of the day. And I think what we were trying to do at Non-Aligned was figure out ways in which to make these stories much more appealing to a wider audience. And I think that often entails focusing on the story first, figuring out what is interesting about this, rather than these kind of, I'd say, more old-fashioned NGO videos where it's essentially an NGO paying some money to have someone promote themselves and to have them look good. And at the end of the day, I think people can see through that, and it's just not always the most compelling video to watch. And so yeah, that was kind of our goal. Figure out how to make stories that are just really interesting and that anyone would want to watch, and then figure out ways to tie this to the work that NGOs are doing.
Can you develop a little bit about how you do that as a photographer? I think you mentioned something about time, having more time to talk through with NGOs, which seems to be kind of a critical component. Is there anything else you would add?
Yeah, I mean, I think, whenever we sit down with an NGO or a new client, we kind of have to ask them a few fundamental questions. A, who's the video for? Who do you want ultimately watching it at the end of the day? Is it just going to be played at a donor conference, or are you trying to play it to a wider audience on social media? B, what kind of length are you looking for? Like, often people will come to us and say, we want a 15-minute documentary. And, our immediate reaction is, who's going to watch a 15-minute documentary? I mean, no, nobody has an attention span for that today. if you want to put it on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, you're going to have to make it more like 1 minute, or 30 seconds even. And then it becomes, what message do you want to convey, and how do we do this in the quickest way possible, with the fewest number of characters in that video to create a compelling case about what it is, what the ultimate message is.
And how do you navigate the briefs from NGOs or comes professionals when they don't align with your vision in that way? Have you had experiences where you kind of had to negotiate a little bit or push back a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think generally, when you're able to sit down with someone in a room and express your concerns, people are generally fairly amenable to taking those those concerns in and figuring out a way around it. But it has happened before where someone wants us to do a video with, let's say they want to put this character in that video who might be some their boss, let's say, from the organization, and we can clearly tell that, look, people aren't going to want to watch this guy talk about this, but you can tell that from their point of view it's very, very important to do that, and we'll push back on that. But at the end of the day, we also have to realize that they're the client and they get what they want. So it's a delicate balance between pushing back, but also accepting that if someone wants us to do something a particular way, then we have to kind of respect that.
And something else that comes to mind is that oftentimes stories, narratives, photographs in the development sector can be, cliche, and that can be damaging as well for the people themselves that you photograph. And I wonder if that's what you mean as well by new narratives, and if you think there is a need to portray people differently for their own dignity.
Yeah. I think to a certain extent, a lot of the cliches that people do complain about, this kind of poverty porn photography, has changed. I think most people are aware that doesn't really work, and it's also in fairly poor taste. So at least I haven't seen that as being a huge problem in kind of my line of work. I haven't had anyone push me towards that direction. Generally, actually, I'd say kind of once I'm in the field, I kind of have a fairly free range to photograph what I want. But I think, I have faced kind of other ethical dilemmas, I think, with NGOs photographing certain subjects or certain projects. I think the development world is pretty broken at the moment. I think a lot of the projects or a lot of the NGOs are run extremely inefficiently. A lot of the projects are done not always in the best way possible. And there are times where you come across a project in the field that is not working in the way that the NGO says it is. And then that becomes a problem because you're the person who's been sent there to essentially say what a great program it is. And how do you kind of navigate that line between, satisfying the NGO, but also not completely lying about something that isn't necessarily working the way they say it is on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's a message that comes back a lot, and as photographer you are carrying the message, and I wonder if that's also shaping your need to work on more personal projects so that you have more flexibility in terms of, how you work and the message that you carry.
Yeah, for sure. I think, when you when you're doing something for yourself, then you have no one either influencing how it's done or telling you how to do it. Um, and this is something I'd really love to see kind of maybe change a little with comms. I think it's annoying to see photographers have so many personal projects and then none of those personal projects really intersect with what they're doing for clients. And I briefly showed the project while I was talking about my photography. It's called Demographica, and it was essentially a project where I was kind of trying to take a statistical typology of a population. It was the Kenyan population. It was supposed to represent the demographic makeup of that population, and I think that's a really fascinating project because it really talks about the changing demographics of Africa, and particularly how young Africa's population is. And that's going to have huge consequences for the future. And this is something that all development agencies are going to have to think about really, really hard when they create their programs, and that the whole world is essentially going to have to contend with, because it's going to have huge consequences from everything from immigration to economic development. And I I really tried to pitch that project to several UN agencies, and there was one that did kind of pick it up to their credit. But I think maybe as kind of a suggestion to the NGO comms world is to not necessarily always commission your own projects, but to figure out a way to hear from photographers about projects they're already working on, because often they've given their own personal projects a lot more thought than they would a project that they're working for on a client. And often they're able to, they're working on these projects over much longer scales of time, and they're doing them much better than they would an assignment for a client.
Yeah. Well, thanks first for sharing the demographic, because project, because I was going to ask you more about that. But on your last point, just to slightly play devil's advocate, I think the budgets for development, at least for agencies in the UK, are shrinking, and it's becoming harder and harder to have budgets for comms. This being said, I think you make your point that what can be really helpful is to have more of a conversation, to have more trust in photographers and work with them maybe over the longer term, so that there's a longer term collaboration and a trust with the photographer. I mean, that's what I'm hearing you say, essentially.
Yeah, and I totally take your point that comms budgets are being slashed, or they're extremely low, and it's very hard to justify hiring a photographer to take photographs. But I would counter that with the fact that comms budgets shouldn't be seen as kind of just ticking boxes and documenting projects. They should be seen as an investment into that NGO's future, as a way to actually get more money out of donors, out of the general population, right? It's photographs that inspire people to donate in the first place, and to learn about stories they might have not otherwise known about. And I think, if you see a big corporation like Nike or McDonald's, they're spending millions of dollars every year on promoting their own brands. They're not doing that to tick some box somewhere. They're essentially doing that to sell a product. And I think NGOs have to kind of start thinking about comms in the same way that big corporation does. They're essentially advertising their service to the general public. And if they do a good enough job of that, then the general public will respond by either donating more money to them or maybe pressuring their governments into paying more attention to those issues. So yeah, I mean, I can see maybe in the immediate term that comms department might have a small budget and not want to hire a photographer, but ultimately, I think there needs to be a quantum shift where those departments are maybe elevated to, a much more important position with much more money, because they're the only department that isn't necessarily going to be spending money, but could also be earning money out of their work.
As someone who works with communications, I couldn't agree more. And I think, my own experience is that communication, I don't work for NGOs, but my experience is that oftentimes communications is, at least how it's thought out in initial projects, it's not kind of centerpiece. It obviously varies. I'm quite lucky in the project that I work on at the moment, but I know that, it's not always the case. I see that we're the clock is ticking. So there's one final question I want to ask you, and I think it's quite an important one, so I don't want to miss it. But it was more talking about consent and consent form, and how you ask for consent, and I imagine when you're working for an NGOs, you have to fill in some consent forms, and if you can comment on how useful they are and your own experience with seeking consent.
Yeah, for sure. And this is a kind of personal gripe I raised with Elise in our pre-interview. Yeah, I have a big problem with consent forms, because I think although the intent with consent forms is good, on the ground they basically don't work. And I guess for anyone who doesn't really know kind of how consent forms work, essentially what happens is when you're out in the field, you carry these consent forms, and whoever you photograph, you essentially have to get them to sign this form, which sounds great. It sounds like, oh well, if someone's going to sign that, well then they know what's happening on the ground. But in reality, most people I'm photographing probably don't know English, might be illiterate as well, and so kind of getting someone to put a consent form in front of these people that they can't read, don't understand, or written in a kind of legal jargon that probably I don't even 100% understand, means that people are signing away rights that they don't understand. And I think, I'm not sure 100% what the solution is, but I think a big part of consent comes from, that kind of relationship the photographer has with his subject, and that responsibility that the photographer has to make sure that he's not exploiting someone when he's photographing them, and that he does have their permission in some form, whether that's verbal or even a look. Generally, when you're photographing someone, you know whether they want to be photographed or not. And I think, a good photographer, even if they see a good photograph or a good portrait, let's say, that involves someone that doesn't want their photograph taken, they'll kind of have enough respect to be like, okay, fine, I'll go on to the next person or whoever it is who is willing to be photographed. So yeah, I think I see this as a slightly dangerous trend that I don't particularly like. And, like I said before, I don't have the answer for it of what would be the better solution, but I'm pretty sure this isn't the right solution.
Yeah, it sounds like oftentimes consent form are more a form of protection for the organizations rather than, protection for the people who are being photographed. Ideally, you
Yeah.
would obviously have both, but the fact that a lot of consent forms are, in English and in Western jargon doesn't make any sense. I mean, I wonder if you've ever been asked to audio record consent. Is that something that that is being done?
Yeah, I think for video we do this a lot, and I think for video it works out quite well, because with video often you're sitting down with someone to interview with them,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're going and collecting B-roll, and so that's fairly easy, right? Like in video, someone actually has to be part of the process. If someone doesn't want to be filmed or interviewed, well then all they have to do is just not talk. So I think because it's more collaborative, it's a lot easier. But a photograph, you can take a quick little picture and then move on. So it becomes a lot trickier.
Yeah, and I think ultimately what we want is to better train photographer to, as you say, spend time with the people that are photographed to explain what the project is about, and the consent form is sort of almost secondary, because the photographer knows how to actually makes it clear what they're doing. But I don't know if
Sure, and I should point out also that it's not always the photographer necessarily talking to the person, because again, you're usually going through an intermediary who who speaks the local language.
Yes.
And so, it also really depends on them. What are they asking the person? How much pressure do they have from their NGO to get the person's permission? And that's where I think, I said sometimes permission is just a look between you and the person, because you aren't always able to ask someone. But I would say in 99% of cases, whether someone actually wants to photograph or not. Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to end here, and we'll now have time for Q&A. So I'll just stop the conversation now.
All right, great. Thanks.
Thanks, Tobin, and thanks, everyone. I'll just turn my video on. Tobin, feel free to turn it on if you want. I don't know how your connection is. So we'll now move on to questions. Hi, Tobin. Great to see you.
Hey, you guys.
So we've got quite a few questions already, which is great. You can keep posting them, and we'll sort of go through them. The event will finish at the hour, so we have 20 minutes or so. So there's a question by Osman. I'll take them in order. The first one, which is very much around photography versus video and the evolution of the two mediums. So the question is photography as good at evoking an effective call to action or an emotional response, given the increasing demand generally for video and the prevalence of people with cameras everywhere? So your thoughts on the evolving landscape of photography versus videography and other media?
For sure. Yeah, I do video myself, so I'm not necessarily a hater of the medium as a lot of photographers are. But no, I would argue actually that photography is better at evoking emotion. And in some ways, I think it's a lot more effective than video. I think the problem in the industry, and one of the reasons that photography has kind of gone down, or demand for photography has gone down and demand for video has gone up, is because I think 20 years ago, cameras were more expensive, particularly with film. You kind of had to have a lot more technical ability in order to be a photographer. Whereas now, anyone with a smartphone can effectively be a photographer. But I think there's an underappreciation of what a good photograph can do. And I think that's kind of what irks maybe some photographers, is that a lot of NGOs kind of will say, well, we can just do this ourselves and save a bunch of money on hiring a real photographer. But they don't realize that actually a good photographer and the right photographer can create an image that really does evoke a lot more emotion than I think a video can. Having said that, I think the two mediums can complement each other. So that doesn't mean that I think video doesn't have a place. It definitely does.
And that's interesting as well from an ethical perspective. Something I often get asked is there a difference when you look at ethics between a photograph and a video? And, you know, what I think about is with a photograph, there is more of a risk of locking people on a certain fixed narrative, whereas with a video, you know, you have more to say. Maybe the people themselves can speak, can be interviewed in a video. So I don't know, this is a thought that I've had also with video. Maybe you can craft a narrative a certain way and that has ethical issues. I wonder if you've had thoughts around, you know, the difference from an ethical perspective between videos and photography.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a difference, and you make some good points there, but I would also argue that ultimately, you know, both mediums can be kind of manipulated in different ways. So, you know, I've actually found that video in a way is a lot more fake than a photograph. Generally in photojournalism and NGO photography, you're not moving people around, you're not getting anyone to do anything that they're not normally doing. Whereas I feel like video tends to be a lot more scripted, and you'll see this kind of throughout the process of making a video, right? You write a script and you give it to the client, and then you essentially go and find the shots in order to make that video. Whereas in photography, you generally don't need to plan it as much, and so you just go out to the field and you figure out what you're shooting on the day. So yeah, I mean, I don't think one you could say would be kind of more manipulatable than the other.
So question from Verity. She's asking, how do you find ways to do justice to representing a community or a situation within a short space of time when assignments have tight turnarounds, which I'm sure is a common trend within the sector.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question to answer. I'm not really sure how to, other than, you know, you just try your best. I think, you know, this is sometimes why it's nice as a photographer to kind of maybe have a certain attachment, you know, a background with a certain country. And I think I kind of have this with Somalia. You know, I've been working there for a long time. So even though, and sorry, you know, Somalia is a really difficult place to work. And the one thing you never have in Somalia is time because of security concerns. You know, often you get out a community, and as soon as you're out of the car, your security is telling you that you need to leave. And so, you know, sometimes I've had to take photos in as little as 10 minutes, which, you know, clearly you're not going to be able to kind of do justice to the community when you've got that little time. But I think, you know, you just got to try your best, and it does help when you know the country, if you know the town, if you know the community itself, and if you're able to go back to be able to, you know, photograph them as kind of as well as you can.
Do you feel that NGOs recognize the need for more time, and are you able to push back sometimes and ask for more time? I mean, I'm sure that more time means more money.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, time always translates to money. And again, particularly in a place like Somalia, it's really difficult because of security. You know, if you're photographing in Mogadishu, security costs $1,500 a day. And, you know, that doesn't include your flights, your day rate, and everything else that's involved. So it's really hard to justify spending money on a photographer in a place like Somalia. But yeah, I don't know. I think generally, as soon as you sit down with someone and you kind of tell them how much time you do need, you know, you kind of work together to try to figure out, you know, the best way forward. Although having said that, you know, I mean, last week I did a shoot in Uganda, and it was the first time ever where I told the client I only needed 3 days, and she told me to take 4. And I was kind of laughing about that because I think that's the first time where someone's insisted that I take longer on an assignment than, you know, than I've asked for.
And just to give us an idea, this is something I wanted to ask you, and then I realized in hindsight I didn't ask you. What's your pie chart looking like in terms of how, how many of your commissions are from NGOs, how many are from, more maybe media, your own personal projects? What does that look like?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's changed a lot during COVID. The kind of client slice of that pie chart has gone down. Maybe the journalism media part has gone a little bigger, and the personal projects slice has gotten way bigger. And I would, it's very tricky, I think, because obviously my NGO clients actually pay the most. Journalism clients really don't pay very much, not enough to make a living. And I think that's kind of why a lot of us do end up veering into, these kind of parallel careers as, humanitarian photographers or NGO photographers. And then obviously the personal projects pay the least. So, I think when work is good, what happens is you end up doing a lot more work for NGOs, and then the other areas kind of suffer a little.
So we have a question from Anya. Photography, as you said, is very effective at evoking emotions of humanitarian situations and is often used to raise funds. To what extent do you think photography is a limited medium to address injustices because of how it plays on emotions, rather than highlighting the political systems and power structures that lead to these humanitarian situations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think you can deny that photography is definitely a limited medium. I mean, I think every medium, has a kind of niche at what it's best at. And yeah, photography is definitely good at evoking emotion. And I'd say, if you do have a humanitarian situation, it's that photograph that will kind of bring attention for a lot of people to that situation. But, I think it definitely has to be, done alongside, an article or a video or something a bit more substantial where you can get a bit more context. But that's not. I feel like that kind of, in a way, cheapens photography a bit, or sounds like it cheapens photography a bit. But I think, photography just complements writing or any other form of communication. It complements those other mediums really well. So I think it should just always be done in tandem with that. And people have to realize, a photograph won't always give you the full picture.
I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but I wonder if you remember of any particular projects where you felt that photography was particularly useful at, highlighting the overarching kind of maybe political structures or institutions rather than just the people on the ground. It can be how photographs were, associated with words. I guess it doesn't have to be just the images, how they're assembled and what they're used for.
I think this maybe gets back a little into what I was talking about earlier with the difference of kind of that classic photojournalism where you're just going to a situation, taking photographs of that situation to really illustrate it, and then the type of photography that tends to be a bit more conceptual. And I think kind of maybe going back to Demographica, that's where I think actually the photographs were illustrating pretty interesting problem in a fairly different way to what's usually seen. It's Africa's population is extremely young and growing very, very fast, and that's going to have huge consequences for the continent. I don't think Africa's leaders or even NGOs have really come to grips with that yet. So I think, maybe that's an example of a project that can illustrate an issue really well that, you know, maybe just reading an article about that issue wouldn't in the same way.
So moving on to two questions by Catherine. I think I'll just ask the second one because the first one is quite long, but she's asking, she's saying your work is highly stressful and potentially traumatizing environments. Can you comment on how you protect your own mental health and deal with trauma, vicarious trauma from others' experiences? And this is something Catherine and I have actually talked about a little bit, how that is an ethical issue in a sense as well, the sort of mental health of, you know, those who are exposed to the situations.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when I worked in Somalia, that's kind of when probably mental health was, you know, probably kind of a fairly pressing issue or something you had to at least think about. You know, it's a fairly stressful environment. Obviously, it's very dangerous, but it's also a fairly monotonous environment. When you're living there, you're kind of living in the green zone. You know, it's a military base. There's not that much room for interaction or any freedom. And then you're going out every day, and you're putting yourself in danger, and you know, you're not always seeing the nicest things. And you could see it on the base. You know, the joke was always that, you know, half the people drank too much and the other half kind of became health freaks. And I think I definitely veered more towards the kind of trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle. I was pretty lucky because the base there is actually on the ocean, so I was able to take up surfing while I was there. There just so happened to be a good wave there, and that for me was, you know, was amazing, because after a long day of work, I could basically grab my surfboard, go into the ocean, and surf for a couple hours, and that would completely clear my head.
That's good. A few questions on consent. We'll very briefly wrap them into one because there's quite a few comments on that, and I think generally in this conversation people are quite curious about consent form. So maybe you can just delve a little bit more into how you ask for consent. And so Jack says that, you know, would you not be working with a local translator to create a simple form? You mentioned that they're often in English. How come, you know, are they never in the local languages? And also, you know, making sure that it explains the wider context. What are the risks for the population? Is this usually what consent includes?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. A few different questions there. Yeah. Okay. I think, yeah, I mean, you can't really create your own consent form and simplify it, because it is at the end of the day a legal document. So you kind of have to depend on what you're given. Sometimes they are in local languages, but also sometimes you're working in areas like, let's say, a refugee camp where you've got multiple languages being spoken. So, you know, again, the practicalities of that are harder than they might at first seem. In terms of the the danger kind of posed to a person if you photograph them, that was always a real concern in Somalia, and it, you know, it still is, because a lot of these people live in communities where Al-Shabaab is still very much present, and if they are seen interacting or being photographed by you know, a foreigner, you know, there could be consequences to that. You know, yes, you could solve that with a consent form, but I think ultimately it's your responsibility as a photographer to actually have a conversation with the people you're photographing, using a local translator if you can't communicate directly with them, and do it that way, rather than, you know, maybe getting someone to sign a consent form they don't quite realize, and you know, potentially expose them to a security risk that way. Sorry, did I miss out anything on that question?
No, I think, well, I mean, I think there's lots to say about it, but essentially it isn't, you know, there isn't a clear black or white answer, and it would probably So I think Jack responded. She says, sorry, when I say form rather than legal piece of paper, which people might not be able to read or understand, I meant mainly a guide for the person asking the question. Yeah, and actually that was going to be my question. I mean, you were trained in documentary photojournalism. Is this something that was talked about in your course? Is this something that, you know, photographers, photojournalists are trained around? Or is it, you know, the responsibility of the photographer to kind of pick it up on its own?
No, it definitely wasn't something I ever got any training in. I think it alludes to a question that Catherine wrote a little earlier, where she was asking, you know, should we have kind of a code of conduct? I'm always a little wary of kind of codifying what we should be allowed to do and what we shouldn't, because, you know, in her example, she was talking about a photographer throwing mud at children to get them out of the picture, and whether that would be okay, and whether maybe a code of conduct would stop photographers from doing that. And I don't think it would. I think most people, you know, if you're a generally decent person, you wouldn't do something like that. And a code of conduct that you've read and signed isn't going to necessarily stop you from doing that. I think, you know, everyone has a certain amount of responsibility. And yes, sometimes the lines are blurred over, you know, what we should do and what we shouldn't do. But I think if you can kind of trust your instincts and try to respect the people you're photographing, then, you know, ultimately you're not going to run into too many problems, I don't think.
I think there's two really important points that you've mentioned here that I'll just use as a close. One is that, you know, photographers depend a lot on their instinct, and I think, you know, you build instinct through time, but I think also having more conversation around consent, around ethics, is really important to sort of contribute to that instinct, to ensure that instinct goes into the right direction. And your second point was around, you know, not having guidelines that are too strict, because obviously every situation is different. So I think that's a great segue to our conversation next month with Savannah Dodd, who is the director of the Photo Ethics Center. So she does training around photo ethics, and one of her points is that there's no purpose creating a very specific, you know, do's and don'ts, a code of conduct or code of photo ethics, but it's more around, you know, principles and thinking about, principles of say, you know, dignity, compassion, etc., and how you would apply those in different contexts, rather than having a blanket format, a blanket code of conduct. So let me actually, we're going to close here. There's a few more questions, but we usually try to keep those events on time. Let me, hold on a second. That's not working. But anyways, I just wanted to say that our next event is on the 24th of May, 1 to 2 p.m. with Savannah Dodd. We'll be sharing details by email, so you'll be receiving that shortly. So thank you everyone for joining today, and thanks Tobin. It was a great conversation.
Great. Thank you.
Found it useful.
All right, have a good one. Bye.
Bye everybody.